A stroke doesn't wait for the right moment. It doesn't care that the man it's targeting is worth $400 million, that he's sitting in the most expensive private dining room in San Francisco, or that the business deal he's trying to close could reshape an entire industry. It simply arrives quietly at first, like a door slowly swinging shut on everything a person has ever controlled. Dominic Varro felt it as a tingling in his right hand. He was mid-sentence, explaining to the three men seated across from him why Varro Capital's acquisition of a Pacific shipping conglomerate was not a gamble but an inevitability, when his fingers simply stopped cooperating. The wine glass he was holding listed sideways. A drop of Barolo landed on the white tablecloth like a small, dark bruise. He set the glass down carefully and folded his right hand into his left under the table. Nobody noticed. He was the kind of man people watched too closely to notice anything at all. At 61, Dominic Varro had built his private equity firm from a two-room office above a dry cleaner in the Richmond district into one of the most feared acquisition vehicles on the West Coast. He was compact, fastidiously dressed, and possessed of a particular kind of stillness that powerful men cultivate deliberately. He didn't fidget, he didn't hedge, he did not allow his face to report anything his mind hadn't approved first. The tingling crept upward toward his wrist. Meridian, San Francisco's most aggressively exclusive members-only restaurant, had been his choice specifically because it did not tolerate disruption. The private dining suite on the second floor held 8 tables, each separated by enough space that conversation was genuinely private. The walls were lined with pale ash wood. The lighting was warm and oblique. The staff moved like they'd been choreographed, appearing exactly when required and vanishing completely otherwise. Standing just outside the carved wooden partition that separated the suite from the service corridor was Sabine Achford. She was 29, though exhaustion had given her the careful, watchful eyes of someone older. Her dark hair was pinned up under the mandatory requirement of Meridian's front-of-house guidelines, and her uniform, ivory blouse, black trousers, the restaurant's small silver pin at the collar, fit well because she'd had it tailored herself after the off-the-rack version kept catching on her left elbow. Small adjustments. She was good at those. She wasn't supposed to be working the private suite tonight. Anton, the senior server who normally handled Mr. Varro's table, had called out 20 minutes before service with what the scheduling manager described simply as a situation. Sabine had been pulled from the main floor, where the tips were reliable, if unremarkable, and sent upstairs with 2 hours' notice and no briefing beyond the name on the reservation and the instruction to be invisible. She needed the gratuity. She always needed the gratuity. In the one-bedroom apartment she shared with her younger brother Theo in the Tenderloin, a manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter between a half-eaten sleeve of crackers and the electric bill. Inside the envelope was a letter from the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center outlining the timeline for Theo's upcoming spinal fusion surgery. The procedure, necessary to correct the progressive congenital scoliosis that had bent his spine into a curve so severe it was now compressing his lung, required a pre-surgical deposit of $120,000. Their insurance covered 60% of what the plan considered reasonable costs, a figure that bore no relationship to what the surgery actually cost. The gap between what the insurance would pay and what the hospital required was a number. Sabine had memorized the way other people memorized phone numbers. She woke up thinking about it. She had been 2 semesters away from finishing her pre-med degree at UCSF when their father's diagnosis arrived. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, the kind of late that meant they were managing a timeline rather than a treatment. She'd taken a leave of absence that became a withdrawal, that became a permanent change of plans. Her father had died 14 months later. Theo was 15 and couldn't work. Sabine had started at Meridian as a floor server 4 years ago and had moved up through competence and sheer reliability. She wasn't floor staff anymore. She was one of 3 people in the building trusted to handle the private suite. She was proud of that, even when it felt like the wrong thing to be proud of. Inside the dining room, she watched through the narrow gap in the partition as Dominic Varro resettled his hand on the tablecloth. Something about the movement was off. She had grown up watching her father manage pain, the deliberate rearranging of limbs, the controlled breath, the strategic shift of attention outward to cover what was happening inward. She recognized the pattern the way you recognize a song from just the first 2 notes. She stepped into the room to refill the water glasses. "Everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Varro?" she asked, addressing the table generally, her voice at the register Meridian required, warm, quiet, utterly unobtrusive. Varro turned his head toward her. For just a fraction of a second, his eyes didn't quite track to her face the way they should have. They arrived a beat late, like a signal with a slight delay. "Fine," he said. "We're fine." She refilled the glasses. On her way back around the table, she looked at his right hand where it rested beside his bread plate. His fingers were curled slightly inward, not relaxed. She noticed that the ring on his right hand, a wide gold band, some kind of signet, had been turned inward toward his palm, as if he'd been pressing it against something. She went back to the service corridor and picked up her phone. She pulled up a clinical resource she had bookmarked 2 years ago while reading through her father's neurology consults. Fast, face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911. She added one more from what she'd read since. Sudden severe headache, vision changes, unexplained loss of coordination in a limb. She thought about the wine glass listing. She thought about the delayed eye tracking. She thought about the hand. She set the phone down and went back in to clear the appetizer plates. Varro was speaking again, his voice steady and authoritative, the hand still folded against itself. But as she leaned across to take his plate, she saw it, the almost imperceptible lag on the right side of his face when he formed a consonant. Just the right side, as if half of him was running on a slightly slower processor. She straightened. She made a decision in approximately the time it took her to walk back to the partition. She signaled to Marcus, the manager on duty, who appeared from the back hallway with the particular glide of someone who had spent 15 years being urgently needed without ever appearing to hurry. "I need you to come look at table 2, she said quietly. Marcus frowned. "Is there a complaint?" "No. I think Mr. Varro may be having a stroke." The word landed between them like something dropped on tile. "Sabine, I'm not diagnosing him," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm telling you what I'm observing and asking you to come stand in the doorway with me for 30 seconds. They stood in the doorway. Marcus watched. Varro said something that caused the men across from him to laugh, and when he laughed in return, the right side of his face moved a half-second after the left. Marcus had gone slightly pale. "I'll call Dr. Okafor on the member services line." "Call 911 first," Sabine said, "then Dr. Okafor. Stroke is time-sensitive. Every minute of delay increases permanent damage. Please." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. His instinct, she could see, was to protect the room. The ambience, the discretion, the unspoken promise Meridian made to its members that nothing unpleasant would ever intrude on their evening. But she held his gaze and didn't move, and something in her steadiness reached him. He stepped away and made the call. She went back into the room. She didn't create a scene. She didn't hover. She moved to Varro's left side, the unaffected side, and bent down slightly under the pretext of addressing a water spot on the tablecloth. "Mr. Varro," she said quietly, "I'd like to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been experiencing any numbness or tingling in your right arm in the last 20 minutes? He looked at her sharply. The look was the look of a man who controlled information and did not appreciate having it extracted from him. "This is a private dinner," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. The tingling in your right hand. Is it still there?" His jaw tightened. Something crossed his face, not anger, but the terrible specific vulnerability of a man being seen through. "It's nothing," he said. "It's a pinched nerve. I had it looked at. When? 2 weeks ago. And it came back tonight during dinner," she said. It wasn't a question. "Along with some difficulty with your vision, maybe, on the right side." His right hand moved involuntarily, fingers splaying, and then curling closed again. She kept her voice very quiet, so only he could hear it. "There are paramedics coming, Mr. Varro. That's not negotiable. But what I'd like you to do right now is lift both arms out in front of you like this." She demonstrated with her own arms, parallel, palms down, just for a moment. He looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Then he looked at his hands, and she watched him try. His left arm lifted smoothly, his right arm lifted to about 45 degrees and trembled. The color left his face entirely. The men across the table had noticed. One of them, a silver-haired man in his 50s who'd introduced himself earlier as a senior partner from a firm in Seattle, was already half risen from his chair. "Dominic." "What? He needs space," Sabine said with a calm authority that surprised even herself. "Please step back from the table. Someone is coming to help him." She pulled Varro's chair back gently from the table so he had room. She crouched down beside him so she was at eye level, so he wasn't looking up at anyone or feeling diminished. "You caught it," she said. "That matters. The next few minutes are going to feel chaotic, but you're going to be okay." He looked at her. The control he used like armor was cracking at the edges, and what was underneath wasn't fury or arrogance. It was simple, naked fear. "I have a deal," he said. His speech was slightly slurred now on the sibilants, the sounds blurring at the edges. "The papers aren't signed. The papers will still be there," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted, "but you won't be, if you don't let us help you right now." The paramedics arrived 7 minutes after Marcus's call. In that 7 minutes, Sabine stayed beside Varro, monitored his speech for further deterioration, kept the room calm, and quietly guided the 3 other guests toward the far end of the suite, where Marcus had arranged for them to be seated with a quiet drink and no obligation to witness anything further. When the paramedics came through the door with the gurney, Varro looked at Sabine with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You called them," he said. "Yes, I didn't ask you to." "No," she agreed, "you didn't." He was loaded onto the gurney. At the doorway, he turned his head to look back at her one more time. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, still and professional, and completely composed, because it was that or cry, and this was not the place for it. Then he was gone, and the room was very quiet, and Marcus appeared at her elbow to tell her that she was being sent home for the night with full pay, and that management would be in touch about the incident. She understood what the incident meant. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room, picked up her bag, and took the bus home. The letter arrived 9 days later. It was hand-delivered to the restaurant by a woman in a dark blazer who asked for Sabine by name, waited patiently in the front lobby while Marcus went to find her, and handed her a sealed envelope with a polite nod before leaving without explanation. Inside was a single page of very heavy cream stationery. The letterhead read Varro Capital, San Francisco. The letter was brief. It asked her to come to the offices at her convenience, at any time she found suitable, It was signed simply D. Varro. She went on her next day off. The Varro capital offices occupied the top 2 floors of a building on California Street, with views of the bay that were so extravagant they felt almost aggressive. A receptionist showed her to a conference room where the coffee was real and the chairs were upholstered in something that probably had a name she didn't know. She waited 11 minutes. Then Dominic Varro walked in. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him, not diminished. She'd been afraid he might look diminished and had braced herself for it, but calibrated differently. More careful with himself, he walked with the particular deliberateness of a man who had recently been reminded that his body had opinions of its own. His right hand, she noticed, moved normally, full range of motion. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Sit, please," he said, taking the chair across from her. "How are you?" "Fine," she said. "How are you?" "I had a TIA," he said. It was the clinical term, transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, a warning, rather than the catastrophe it so nearly became. It resolved without permanent deficit. My neurologist tells me I should buy lottery tickets because the outcome in my demographic without immediate intervention is significantly less good. He paused. "You intervened immediately." "I noticed something," she said. "I happen to know what to look for. Your manager told me you had some medical training. 2 years of pre-med at UCSF. I left to take care of my family." He looked at her steadily. "Is your family still requiring care?" It was a blunter question than she expected. She answered it directly. "My younger brother needs surgery. Spinal fusion. It's scheduled, but we haven't been able to clear the pre-surgical deposit." She said it without apology or performance, the way you state a fact about the weather. Varro was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the glass, the bay glittered. Somewhere below them, the city made its ordinary noise. "The night it happened," he said, "before you called 911, I heard you tell your manager that stroke treatment is time-sensitive and that every minute of delay increases permanent damage. That's accurate," she said. "My neurologist used the same phrase, almost word for word." He picked up a pen from the table and turned it over in his fingers. An old habit, she suspected, the physical thinking of someone who processed by touching things. I asked him afterward what the realistic outlook was if treatment had been delayed by another 20 minutes. He told me the odds of a significant lasting deficit, memory, motor function, language, were above 70%. He set the pen down. "I'm 61 years old. I have been building something for 35 years. The prospect of losing language and motor function at 61 is not abstract to me." "I know," she said quietly. "I don't think you do," he said, not unkindly. "I don't think anyone does, until they're lying in a hospital looking at brain scans and trying to calculate what version of themselves might come home." He looked at her. "I was afraid. I haven't been genuinely afraid in a long time. You sat beside me and you were completely calm, and I don't know if you were actually calm or if it was the best acting of your life, but either way it helped." "It was about 60-40, she said. Something shifted in his expression. He almost smiled. "The restaurant terminated your position," he said. She nodded. The letter had arrived 3 days after the incident. Violation of client contact protocols, compromise of dining experience, failure to defer to management in an emergency situation. She hadn't been surprised. She had, in a certain private way, been almost relieved. The decision had been made for her, and she didn't have to be angry about it, because anger took energy she didn't have to spare. "Their loss is a liability to me, practically speaking," Varro said, "and a moral failure, which matters to me more than they would probably expect." He opened a folder on the table in front of him. "I've spoken with the president of UCSF's School of Medicine. They have a pathway for returning students with prior coursework. a structured re-entry program. Your transcripts are excellent. You would qualify." Sabine went very still. "I'm proposing," Varro continued, his tone neither grandiose nor especially gentle, simply direct, "to fund the remainder of your medical education. Full tuition, living allowance, and a research stipend, because your grades suggest you should be doing research and not waiting tables." He turned a page. "I'm also proposing to cover your brother's surgery in full. Not a loan, a gift, deposited directly to the hospital's accounts this week, so the surgery can be scheduled without the deposit contingency." The room was very quiet. Sabine looked at the folder. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands on the table, which were perfectly still, because she had learned to be still when everything inside her was not. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered, and she wasn't embarrassed to ask it. "Because you acted without any calculation of what it would cost you," Varro said. "You didn't know who I was when you first noticed something was wrong. You didn't know if calling 911 would cost you your job. You didn't factor any of that." He paused. "I've spent 35 years in a world where every single action is calculated, where no one does anything without first determining what it returns. You walked into a room, saw a man in danger, and acted on what you knew." He looked at her steadily. "I've spent a lot of money on loyalty in my life. I've never actually encountered it." Sabine was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Please, I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't do it because I thought you were important or because I wanted something from you. I did it because I recognized what was happening, and I knew what to do, and it would have been wrong not to." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying that to be humble. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that accepting this isn't a transaction for me. It's not a trade." "I know," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I accept." She said it simply and without ceremony, because it was the right answer, and she was too tired for ceremony. The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. Theo was 22 and had spent the last 8 years watching his spine slowly betray him, the curve deepening by increments, the breathlessness after 2 flights of stairs, the way he slept on his side with a pillow between his knees, because any other position meant waking up in pain. He had not complained about it in the way that would have made it easier for Sabine to witness. He had simply accommodated it, the way he accommodated everything, with a quiet adaptability that she found more heartbreaking than any amount of expressed suffering would have been. The morning of the surgery, Sabine sat with him in the pre-op bay while the nurse went through the intake checklist. He was calm. He'd always been calmer than the situation seemed to warrant. "You okay?" she asked. "I've been okay," he said. "I'm going to be better." She held his hand until the anesthesiologist came in. She waited 5 hours in a family lounge on the 4th floor of UCSF Medical Center, drinking bad coffee and reading the same 3 pages of the same paperback 4 times. A surgical resident she didn't know came to tell her that the procedure had gone well, that the instrumentation was in excellent position, that Theo was in recovery and doing fine. She nodded and thanked him, and then sat for a few more minutes before she allowed herself to cry, quietly, with her forehead against the cold window, looking out at the grey November sky over the Richmond district. When she went in to see him, he was groggy and slightly greenish from the anesthesia, with a blood pressure cuff on one arm and a blanket pulled to his chin, and he looked up at her and said, in a voice that was slow and blurred but completely recognizable, "I can breathe easier already." She laughed, which was embarrassing, but the nurse in the corner pretended not to notice. The UCSF re-entry program orientation was in January. Sabine received a packet in the mail with her cohort information, her assigned advisor's name, and a course schedule that started her in the spring semester. She sat at the kitchen table with the packet in front of her and read through it twice, slowly, the way she read things she wanted to understand rather than just process. Theo was doing his physical therapy in the living room. 12 minutes of gentle prescribed exercises twice a day, and she could hear him counting quietly to himself from the other room. She thought about the private dining suite at Meridian, the carved wooden partition, the gap she'd watched through, the specific lag on the right side of a stranger's face when he formed a consonant. She thought about how long she had been carrying the shape of what she'd left behind, not with bitterness exactly, but with the particular ache of unfinished things. She thought about her father, who had never told her what to do with her life, but who had, for as long as she could remember, called her the most thorough person he'd ever met. He meant it as a compliment. She'd understood it as one. She put the packet in her bag for the morning. In March, at a small breakfast hosted by Varro Capital for the inaugural class of what had quietly been named the Varro Foundation Medical Scholars, 7 students, all of them returning to school after interruptions that looked different in the particulars, but shared the same essential shape. Sabine sat at a round table with people who had driven forklifts and managed pharmacies and raised children alone and left countries, all of them pursuing the same stubborn idea that it was not too late. Dominic Varro spoke briefly and without performance. He told the room that he had experienced something the previous autumn that had changed the way he understood what ability was worth, and that this program was his attempt to act on what he'd learned. He did not mention Sabine by name. She appreciated that. Afterward, as the room cleared, he found her by the coffee station. "How's your brother?" he asked. "Walking without pain for the first time in 4 years," she said. He nodded. He looked like a man who had made a decision he was comfortable with, which in her experience was rarer than it sounded. "Good," he said simply. "That's good," she agreed that it was. Outside on California Street, the morning fog was burning off slowly the way it did in March, the sky going from white to pale blue in increments too gradual to observe directly. She walked to the bus stop and stood in the thin sunlight with her bag on her shoulder and her course packet inside it, and she thought about the number of times she had stood on this particular street in the last 4 years, running for early shifts, running for late buses, running on fumes, and how different it felt to be standing still. Theo texted her a photo from home. He was standing in the kitchen in his socks, spine straight, holding a mug of coffee with both hands and grinning at the camera with the specific satisfaction of a person doing something that used to hurt. She looked at the photo for a long time. Then the bus came and she got on.